First Nations is, as Tom Berger has said, that I'm going to answer because he's very first question and asking how big what's going to be. That's his answer, but I really, for me as the leader of the National Council Chief, this is what reminds us
Mr. Berger.
where are you?
Can I just get a shot of you guys all together? Are you guys all here? Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Come in, Tom. Come on, Tom.
Head on over.
Get that on our meeting, Mr. Lawyer.
Don't show photographer. When the Ross River case. That's our
Okay, how are we doing?
I'd like to just have you guys look at my new one.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Margaret Rosling. I am legal counsel to representatives of the 4 plaintiffs seated with me, and I've been asked to moderate the press conference this morning. As you all know, we've invited you here today to announce the commencement of a lawsuit against the government of Yukon that we hope will force the government to implement the land use plan for the Peel River watershed. Mr. Berger, who is seated to my left, and representatives of all of the plaintiffs in the action are here with me at the table this morning, and I'll introduce them in a moment, but first just wanted to go over with you a bit of the format for the press conference this morning. Each of the representatives of the plaintiffs and Mr. Berger will make some remarks, and we would welcome some questions from the floor, and also for those who I understand are participating by telephone after each of them have made their introductory comments. We will have an open mic on the floor situated in the second row here, so if you do have questions, we invite you to come up to the mic and we will respond to you once you've asked your question. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce the people sitting with me up here at the table. To my left is my colleague, Mr. Thomas Berger. He is legal counsel on the case. To his left is Chief Ed Champion, Chief of the Nacho-Nyack Dun First Nation. To my right is Chief Eddie Taylor, Chief of the Trondeck Gwechen. Jill Cracknell to Eddie's right, and she is the Executive Director of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society Yukon chapter. And last but not least, Karen Balt-Galis to my far left, and Karen is the Executive Director of the Yukon Conservation Society. As I mentioned earlier, each of these people that I've introduced are representatives of the 4 plaintiffs in the lawsuit that we will be commencing today. So I'm going to invite my colleague, Mr. Thomas Berger, to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, Margie, and ladies and gentlemen. There is a lawsuit that will be commenced by filing the statement of claim in the Supreme Court of Yukon this afternoon at 2 p.m. and I want to tell you about that lawsuit and why it has been brought. It's a lawsuit that nobody wanted to bring, but the government of Yukon has forced these plaintiffs, seated here with me, to go to court not only in defense of First Nations rights and environmental values in Yukon, but also to uphold principles entrenched in the Constitution. In 1993, Yukon First Nations, together with Canada and the government of Yukon, signed the Umbrella Final Agreement. I know it sounds technical, but this was part of the new constitutional settlement that is spread across our 3 northern territories. The Umbrella Final Agreement provided for the settlement of Yukon First Nations land claims, and many would say it has been the means of progress towards social and economic stability in the territory. And its provisions have formed the basis of long-range land use planning in the Yukon. And these provisions are entrenched in the Constitution. And as SFU Professor Douglas MacArthur said in the Globe and Mail on January 20th, there is a new constitutional settlement in the North. And this case represents a profound test of that constitutional settlement. It is about the future of the Peel River watershed, an area of 67,500 square kilometers, as large as New Brunswick. Now, land use planning is not something that the government of Yukon can decide on its own. It's really zoning on a vast scale, but it's not something that the government of Yukon can decide on its own. Under the Umbrella Final Agreement, in each region of the Yukon, it is to be done by a Land Use Planning Commission in consultation with First Nations and affected communities. Now, a commission was established called the Peel Commission, jointly by the government of Yukon and the First Nations in 2004, that's 10 years ago. The Peel Commission spent 7 years and consulted widely with Yukoners, and in 2009 recommended that 80% of the Peel watershed be protected and 20% be open for oil and gas and mineral development. Now, at that point, under the Umbrella Final Agreement, the government of Yukon had the right to reject the Peel Commission's recommended plan. But at that time, after due consideration, the government of Yukon decided that it would not reject it, but would simply propose certain modifications to the recommended plan. Now, that was a choice binding on the government of Yukon. Those proposed modifications were in writing and were considered by the Commission. The Commission, in written reasons, adopted some of those modifications and rejected others. And I mentioned the procedure under the Umbrella Final Agreement because this isn't as if the government of BC wanted a commission to look into land use planning in a region of our province. And the commission completed its work and made recommendations to the government. The government could discard them. That's the situation that usually prevails in the provinces, but not in the Yukon. The government of Yukon, having launched the consultation procedure on the footing that it was only proposing modifications, that it wasn't rejecting the Peel Commission's recommended plan, then proceeded with consultation, because that's what is provided for, extensive consultation with First Nations and with affected communities in the Yukon and indeed in the Northwest Territories. 4 communities in the Yukon and 4 in the Northwest Territories. And that procedure went forward on the footing that the people of the Yukon and the First Nations were considering these proposed modifications. But the government of the Yukon then purported to decide that it still had authority to reject the Peel Commission's land use plan. They presented Yukoners in the 8 affected communities concepts for a new land use plan devised by the government of the Yukon. Their land use plan for the Peel veers sharply away from the Commission's plan. For all intents and purposes, it opens up the vast majority of the watershed to industrial activity. It discards the years of work done by the Peel Commission. It ignores the views of First Nations, Yukoners, and the affected community. No matter how it is viewed, it is a complete rewrite, and it has forced these plaintiffs to go to court. So, in this case, the Supreme Court of Yukon will be asked to uphold the 1993 constitutional settlement in the Yukon under the Umbrella Final Agreement. In the North, territorial governments do not have the absolute authority that the provinces have when it comes to land use planning. The government of Yukon is constrained by the constitutional settlement of 1993. It cannot say, we were elected so we can do whatever we want. The procedure laid down in the Umbrella Final Agreement must be followed, and these plaintiffs will be asking the Supreme Court of Yukon to declare that the Peel Commission's work cannot be discarded and that the final recommended plan must be upheld.
Thank you, Tom. And now I'll turn it over to Jill Cracknell, the Executive Director of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society Yukon Chapter. Jill?
Thank you, Maureen. Seaports Yukon's mandate is to ensure the Yukon's land, water, and wildlife are safeguarded for current and future generations. We've been working with the First Nations and the public to protect the Peel River watershed for over 15 years. And we've been involved in this land use planning process for the Peel region since its inception. We're very honored to bring this case on behalf of the public interest with the First Nation of Na-Chin-Ai-Dan, the Chanda-Quechin, and the Yukon Conservation Society. The Peel watershed is one of the last remaining ecologically intact wilderness watersheds left in North America. It's over 7 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. And the Peel in its entirety, as it is now, is large enough to ensure the health of populations of large predators and their prey, and it has enough altitudinal up and down and north-south extent to give animals and plants a chance to adapt to climate change. Healthy populations of caribou, sheep, moose, grizzlies, wolverines and wolves roam across the forests and tundra, the mountains and river valleys, and hundreds of thousands of waterfowl and songbirds migrate to the area each year to breed. And people travel from all over the world to paddle these wild rivers in the Peel watershed and to experience this vast landscape where nature unfolds as it has since time immemorial. The public wants to see this area protected. 94% of over 10,000 submissions to government's consultation on the Peel supported the land use plan produced by the inclusive and transparent public process mandated by the Umbrella Final Agreement, which Tom was talking about. That plan recommended 55% permanent protection for the Peel watershed and 25% interim protection, which could be reviewed over time. And now government has issued its own plan to open up more than 71% of this spectacular wilderness watershed to industry and roads. The umbrella final agreement is for all of us. The final agreements are the law of the Yukon. All Yukoners have a right to insist that their constitutionally protected rights are upheld. As a resident of the Yukon, a citizen of Canada, and executive director of Seaports Yukon, I am honored to have Mr. Berger bringing this case on behalf of the many, many people who have expressed outrage, grief, and shame at government's proposal to open up the watershed to industry and roads, and to rectify government's disrespect of the democratic process, the land use planning process, which so many people have participated in. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. I'd like to now invite remarks from Karen Baltgalis. Karen, as I mentioned earlier, is the Executive Director of the Yukon Conservation Society. Karen?
Good morning. The Yukon Conservation Society is a 46-year-old grassroots local conservation organization. We're honored to join the First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun, the Trondek-Wet'suwet'en, and Seaports Yukon in this groundbreaking case, and to be represented by such esteemed legal counsel. The Peel Watershed Land Use Planning Commission followed the land use planning process required by Yukon land claims, and the affected First Nations and Yukon public participated in the process in good faith. The public consultations on the Peel Watershed brought an unprecedented number of responses, the vast majority of which were in favor of the Planning Commission's final recommended plan. Yukon government has betrayed the public trust by ignoring the wishes of the affected First Nations and Yukon public. Yukon government's plan turns the Commission's plan literally on its head. The Commission's plan allows roads and industry in 20% of the watershed. Government's plan allows roads and industry in more than 71% of the watershed. And I say more than 71% because even in the Yukon government's so-called protected areas, mines and all-season access to get at those mines are allowed where existing claims exist. So in reality, Yukon government's plan opens up more like 80% of the Peel watershed to extractive industries. There's a lot of green on the Yukon government's map, which you'll see on the far right in the colors that they created the map in, but don't be misled. It doesn't mean protection. It's more like that, and even in the green areas, which are so-called protected areas, as I say, mines and all-season roads are allowed for existing mining claims, which occupy probably about half of the so-called protected areas. Government says their plan is balanced, but where is the balance when you consider that more than 80% of this vast, wild place that is so important to First Nations and the public is open for business? And where is the balance when you consider that 75% of the Yukon as a whole is open for mineral staking and development? Ironically, despite the fact that Yukon government's plan makes the vast majority of the watershed open to industry, the Yukon Chamber of Mines still says the plan is too restrictive. It seems that the mining industry that Yukon government is catering to is insatiable. Is it really so much to ask that some priceless places remain free of roads and industrial development? The Peel watershed is worth so much more for cultural values, wildlife, as a carbon sink, as a refuge from climate change, and for wilderness tourism than it is for mining. In the Yukon, we have an opportunity to do things differently than they've been done in the South. We can respect First Nations land claims agreements, and we can still keep some vast, wild places healthy and whole as a legacy for the Yukon for Canada and the world. To any companies that may be considering industrial development in the Peel watershed outside of the areas that the Peel Planning Commission designated for industrial development, please note, we will do whatever it takes to protect democracy, protect the land claims agreement, and protect the real plan. We ask companies like Chevron that have mining claims in the Peel watershed to show real corporate citizenship and voluntarily relinquish them. The social capital that companies would receive by making this timely and vital contribution to conservation would far outweigh any economic value that these remote, inaccessible mining claims may have.
Thank you, Karen. I'd now like to call upon Eddie Taylor, Chief of Trondeck-Wichin. Eddie?
My name is Eddie Taylor, Chief of the Trondeck-Wichin. My people have used the resources of the Peel for millennium and still use it on a daily basis today. The Trondeck-Wichin traditional territory includes 3 unspoiled rivers in the western part of the Peel watershed: the Blackstone, the Ogilvie, and the Hart River. The Dempster Highway bisects a portion of the Blackstone and Ogilvie drainage system, but that is the only mark on what is otherwise an unblemished landscape. My family used to take me into the Peel when I was a younger boy. They taught me to fish and to hunt. They taught me to respect the land and the water. These are lessons that I will never forget. Today we take our youth into the Peel to teach them the same lessons. The Trondeck-Wichin are not against responsible mining and responsible industrial development. We have lived closely with mining for over 100 years. Many of my people are miners or work in the mining industry. We have excellent relationships with mining companies that we work hard to maintain. That said, we do not want to see mining in the Peel watershed. To us, that land and water is sacred and should be preserved for future generations. Gotta be preserved for future generations. As our elders say, the Peel is our church, our university, and our breadbasket. It feeds our spirit, our minds, and our bodies. It is a God-given treasure that we want our grandchildren and your grandchildren to inherit the same way we inherited it. In closing, I want to say this: the Peel is our homeland. My people use that land today and have always used it. We need the Yukon Party government to understand the realities of our final agreements. My people are determined to hold the government of Yukon to account for the promises they have made. We will do everything within our power to enforce the terms of our final agreements and protect the Peel watershed. On behalf of all Trondeck-Wichin, I thank you all for being here, sharing this time with us. Masi Cho.
Thank you, Eddie. And I'd now like to turn it over to Chief Ed Champion, Chief of the First Nation of Nacho-Nayak-Dun. Ed.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ed Champion, and I am the Chief of the First Nation of Nacho-Nayak-Dun government. My people have been using the Peel watershed since time immemorial. The vast majority of the 67,500 square kilometers of the Peel watershed is located within the northern half of our traditional territory. We are deeply disturbed by the Yukon government's recent decision regarding the Peel watershed. I'd like to briefly bring 3 major issues and one conclusion clearly to your attention. Number 1, the Yukon government's unilateral decision to accept their own land use plan undermines the existing final agreements of Yukon First Nations. Yukon First Nations fought hard and long for their self-government agreements and will not tolerate them being so blatantly disregarded by this new Yukon government. Nacho-Nayak-Dun just celebrated its 20-year anniversary of achieving self-government based on being together today for our children tomorrow. We have absolutely no choice but to fight this decision to the end to protect our final agreements and the constitutional rights.
It's important to note that in exchange for the promises in our final agreement, the First Nation Notchnaalik Dun agreed to cede, release, and surrender our Aboriginal title to all non-settlement land within our traditional territory. We gave up title to 95% of our land as part of the treaty process. Number two, the Yukon government's unilateral decision to accept their own land use plan has now thrown 7 years of hard work in land use planning out the window. This constitutionally entrenched planning process produced an acceptable land use plan to all stakeholders except this new Yukon government. Notchnaalik Dun initially wanted 100% of the peel protected. We compromised and settled for 80% being protected. We further compromised and agreed to an additional 25% of the peel being open for review in 10 years' time. The final recommended plan that we support protects 55% of the peel. I would say that 100% protection that we initially started off with, down to potentially 55% of the peel being protected, is a significant compromise by all stakeholders. It's interesting to note that a member of the new Yukon government was recently quoted as saying, "The vast majority of my colleagues and I indicated we weren't comfortable with the plan. The Commission's process wasn't flawed, but the product produced by the Commission was. And since we won a majority government, we felt a mandate to proceed in a manner that was the correct one." In other words, the new Yukon government decided they didn't like the final recommended plan. They then proceeded to make a unilateral decision against the affected First Nations' constitutional rights and created their own plan. Number three, the Yukon government's unilateral decision to accept their own land use plan creates uncertainty for resource companies and First Nations. According to the feds, there are $650 billion of natural resources, all near or under First Nation lands across Canada. The resource companies want to extract over the next 10 years. This is important for the Canadian economy, resource companies and First Nations, that if these resources are to be accessed, that it be done right based on trust, certainty, and equity. The Yukon government seems intent on destroying trust, and certainly in the Yukon, which may negatively impact relationships between First Nations and resource companies across Canada. That said, Notchnaalik Dun is open for business and looks forward to the pursuit of responsible economic development as outlined within the plan. Unfortunately, the uncertainty created by the Yukon government makes it a difficult challenge for the affected First Nations and resource companies to do business. In summary, the Yukon government has, under our final agreements, number two, has created its own plan for the Peel watershed. Number three, has created uncertainty for meaningful business relationships between First Nations and resource companies. In conclusion, the Yukon government needs to listen to the people and reverse its position immediately or lose the next election. In closing, I'm cautioning resource companies to exercise caution, as the Notchnaalik Dun government will not look favorably upon any company that has stake in our lands until this lawsuit is settled. On behalf of myself and all Notchnaalik Dun citizens, Masicho.
Thank you, Ed, and others. As I indicated earlier, we invite representatives from the press to come and ask questions, and we'd ask that you do so at the mic that's been set up for that purpose. But before we welcome questions, I did want to acknowledge and welcome First Nations leaders from the North who are with us today. So if you'll just bear with me, I would like to do that now. I'd like to welcome and acknowledge Joe Linklater, Chief of the Vancouver, Nancy Hager, Deputy Chief of the Notchnaalik Dun, Ruth Massey, Grand Chief of the Council of Yukon First Nations, Eric Fairclough, Chief of the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation, Mike Smith, the Yukon Regional Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Ed Schultz, former Grand Chief of the Council of Yukon First Nations, and Carl Sidney, Chief of the Teslin Tlingit Council. And James Allen, Chief of Champagne Neja. Sorry. Late breaking news. So, anyone who would like to ask a question, please come to the mic.
Hi, I'm Jenny Moore with the Canadian Press, and I have two questions. First, you did mention Chevron as a company that has a stake in there, and I just wonder if are there other companies or specific projects that you can name that are in this area?
Just one moment, so you'll ask them one at a time?
Yeah.
Okay, I'd invite Karen to respond to that question.
I won't try to go into a whole list of all the companies because there are over 8,400 mining claims in the watershed. But the point that I'd like to make is that there were only about 1,400 of those mining claims there when the planning process began. And so I actually, quite frankly, view the rest of those many thousands of mining claims as nuisance claims that were staked in order to get compensation, because all of those companies knew that the planning process was going on. They knew that protected areas could be developed. And so I would say that the Yukon government is incorrect when they say that the public would be on the hook for millions of dollars in compensation, because I would say it was a case of buyer beware.
And my second question is for Chief Champion and Chief Taylor. Is it unanimous among First Nations in this region with traditional territories that rejecting the land use plan?
Thank you. Chief Champion?
I wouldn't say we have been put in a position of rejecting the land use plan. The government made that decision on their own.
Are you unanimous? Is there
Absolutely.
unanimous support from all
Among the
First
four
Nations?
First Nations, absolutely, that are affected by it. And we totally expect support from the rest of First Nations in the Yukon. As you can see, the rest have they attended today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Champion. Chief Taylor, did you have anything further to add?
No, I think Chief Champion answered that very clearly. Once again.
Hi, Kurt Petrovich with CBC National Radio News. Just a couple of questions that I would direct at Mr. Berger, but anyone, of course, feel free to answer. I heard some references to we'll do everything within our power, we won't let this happen. A legal challenge like this, I wonder if you could give me some sense, Mr. Berger, how long this is likely to take, and in the interim, what is the risk that development will proceed under the Yukon government's revised land use plan?
Well, the case is the case that the plaintiffs will make is straightforward. That is that the government of Yukon had no authority to seek to impose its own plan developed unilaterally on the First Nations and the citizens of the Yukon. Because, as some of the speakers have pointed out, ordinary Yukoners are entitled to insist upon the umbrella final agreement being upheld. That is entrenched in the Constitution of Canada. It's part of the Constitution, so to speak, of the Yukon. The lawsuit's being filed at 2 p.m. this afternoon. We will, of course, wait for the government of Yukon to file its defense, and normally you would expect that to be done within 21 days. They have, I think, been aware for a long time now that there will be a challenge to the course of action they have adopted, and then we will ask the Supreme Court of Yukon to schedule an early trial, and that's where the lawsuit stands. Now, what the government of Yukon decides to do regarding the new tenures is up to the government of Yukon. We will have to wait and see what they do.
But this is a process that could take years. I mean, if you're talking about the Supreme Court of the Yukon, potentially the Supreme Court of Canada, This isn't something that's going to be resolved quickly.
Well, you know, not every case goes to the Supreme Court of Canada, and not every case necessarily goes to the Court of Appeal. Let's see what the Supreme Court of Yukon does. That's the principal trial court in the Yukon. Let's get there first and see what they have to, see what the judge has to say about this case. And then we'll take it from there.
And to the people on the panel who suggested doing everything possible to protect the land, to protect the interests, does that only extend to every legal option? Are we talking about something else? Of course, as you know, in our own backyard, we have the Northern Gateway pipeline and the dissatisfaction with the Joint Review Panel, and people have already dug in their heels about what they're willing to accept and not accept and what they're willing to do. It seems to me this is on a par with that kind of level of development. Are you able to?
If I could just add a word. The First Nations and the environmental organizations backed by thousands of Yukoners are here launching this lawsuit. It's something that it's within their power to do, and they're doing it. And I understand that there will be more activity in the Yukon this week in support of the lawsuit. I wouldn't, aren't they doing enough right now to please you?
It's not me you have to please, I dare say. I'm just looking for some clarification on what's meant by those sort of vague statements. You know, we'll do whatever we can.
I'd like to call on Eddie Taylor to respond to that question as well, Kurt, and then I'll turn it over to Karen Martin.
We do feel that this legal team we have here is going to be very successful in this lawsuit. And as far as doing more, doing all we can, you bet we will set up protests. They're already occurring in Yukon due to territorial government's behavior and decisions that they've made the last couple of years. Absolutely, we will be protesting if need to be. And as I said a minute ago, the protests are already occurring without First Nation involvement. Merci.
Karen?
Yes, as Chief Taylor said, on Wednesday there are a number of demonstrations expected in Whitehorse and in the affected Peel communities, and even outside of the Peel communities in Whitehorse and the Northwest Territories. So yes, you can expect protests. You can expect voters to use their rights, and I think that this legal challenge is probably our biggest tool, for sure.
Thank you.
I'll also add something to that, if you don't mind. I certainly echo the same thoughts as Chief Taylor, and we will do what it takes. But I'm hopeful that it doesn't get to that point. I was quoted earlier last week as saying that this action by Yukon government has basically kicked a sleeping giant. And I think the Yukon government needs to be aware of two pressures that are going to be exerted on them. And that is the unification of all Yukon First Nations are going to come together on this because it affects them as well as us. I think the other thing, I see some resource companies in the room, and I think there's going to be pressure put on the Yukon government by premiers across the country. I think resource companies are going to realize what's going on here and put pressure on the Yukon government to do what's right. And I don't think it has to go beyond the fact that we have a great legal team, we're doing what's right, we've taken the high road, we're going to maintain the high road. And I think other pressures, as I say, from resource companies will go on the Yukon government, and I think the feds, and yeah, this is going to have the conclusion that it deserves. Merci, Charles.
Damien Gillis, documentary filmmaker. You mentioned mining as one of the key resource development pressures that's driving these attempted changes to the umbrella final agreement. I'm wondering to what extent oil and gas and potentially fracking is a factor in these pressures that are coming right now.
Karen?
Well, fracking has definitely now arrived at the Yukon's doorstep. There's been tremendous public outcry against that possibility. There is currently a select committee on the risks and benefits of hydraulic fracturing considering the issue. And in the meantime, there's a moratorium on fracking. But definitely in the western part of the Peel watershed, even in the Commission's plan, it would be open to oil and gas development. So fracking is something that many First Nations have come out against, have said they don't want on their traditional territories, and certainly the public in the Yukon has been very vocal about that.
Thank you, and a couple of remarks from Chief Taylor.
I believe that it's in there somewhere that fracking probably a hidden agenda at this point. But at this present time, our First Nation has passed a General Assembly resolution that we do not support fracking within our traditional homelands in any way, shape, or form. And that resolution has also come out of the majority of First Nations within the Yukon. I believe there may be, out of the 14, maybe 3 that haven't produced a resolution at this point, but they will be coming. Merci.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Clariane with the CBC, Clariane Thompson based in Whitehorse. I am curious to know from the chiefs how you think this might impact the other regional planning going on in Yukon or to come in the next few years.
Chief Taylor?
It has a direct impact on future land use planning within Yukon. That's why you see many of the First Nation leaders here from Yukon. They know this has a direct impact on their land use planning. There is just no way in this world we can allow the territorial government to do what they want with our homelands. We have a fair say in it. We have an honest say, and we will say our piece and make sure that we are heard. Must be.
Chief Champion?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think the process we've gone through, we've taken the high road, we've done everything right, we've conceded and given, and yet at the end of the day on this land use planning process, we still end up, I was going to use stronger words, but we don't end up with what we thought we were going to get. And it's just simply an example of the other First Nations. And how do you trust this government that is prepared to do this after 7 years of land use planning? Throw it out the window. So it's a problem. Again, kick the giant.
Thank you, Chief Champion, and just some concluding remarks on that subject from Ms. Jill Cracknell. Jill?
Yeah, thank you. I know you asked the Chief, but I'd just like to say on behalf of the public interest as well, land use planning is critical for all of us. It's the stability that we all need, the certainty that everybody needs, including the mining industry and the oil and gas industry. Everybody needs certainty. And the reason we're bringing this lawsuit is partly to create certainty. It isn't certainty when you have areas which are open to industry, where if you look at the maps, the right-hand map on the slide up there are slivers of green going down through a sea of development. This isn't the kind of certainty that the wilderness tourism industry needs. The Peel is an incredibly special area, and the Yukon is very fortunate to have such large spaces which can still be protected, which we can protect for everybody around the world for all time. Going back to what I said about climate change and the need for animals and plants to adapt. We need these kind of spaces for our earth, for ourselves. And so land use planning is a really important part of that. And I would just like to say that the general public has been so disillusioned by this process, by the way government has disregarded their input and their faith in the land use planning going down the road has totally been shattered. So we need to restore that. and government needs to restore that by honouring the final recommended plan produced by the Commission. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from the floor or from the phone?
I'm just curious if you think, Berger, if you think that this might have an impact elsewhere in the country. We know the specificities of a territory versus a province. You alluded to that, but do you think this case, obviously tackles your interest, has potential to be a precedent elsewhere in the country?
Well, it would be a precedent, I think, for the 3 Northern Territories, where their land use planning is greatly conditioned by the land claims agreements entered into over the last 25 years. And if you look at those land claims agreements in the 3 Northern Territories, you'll see that they provide a procedure for land use planning. This is the first test of whether these constitutionally entrenched settlements reached between Canada, representing all of us, in this case the Yukon government, and First Nations, whether they are, whether we're going to live up to them, or whether it was a nice occasion back in 1993 for everybody to sign, take a few bows. It was a glorified photo op. But when we really get down to business, we're at liberty to ignore what is contained in these agreements. And I think this is a profound test of whether the new constitutional settlement in the North, extending over the last 25 years, is going to be upheld or not. And that's the purpose of this lawsuit. Whether governments are obliged to live up to those land claims agreements, entrenched, as I say, in the Constitution of Canada. So this is an important test, certainly for the Northern Territories.
Well, if there's no further questions, I wanted to thank you all for your interest. Thank you for coming. And on behalf of Mr. Berger and all of our clients, good morning.
You're looking right through me. I've done it all. Are you? Okay. We've worked with these year listeners to political messages. Woke up at 3, fell asleep again at 6:30. Then I slept till 8:30 and then I missed it. Are we supposed to stay here? Go ahead. Oh, we don't. You betcha.
My name is Liz Hanson. I'm actually I thought there was all the eyes wide open. Everybody had the best. Nancy just invited us to have the GA. You can't just put aside. Right, nice to meet you.